Okay, well, thank you for showing up. And today we wrap up on Wittgenstein and rule following and all that. And on Friday and Monday we'll move on to Davidson. So I want to start out with Tonk. Again, as from last time, and just review where we got to, and in fact maybe just review where we've got to altogether. So we started out with Wittgenstein looking, then I'll start out with this Tonk stuff, and the next section is about offensive language, but don't get excited, I'm not going to give examples or something. But I do want to bring out, it's not really central for our purposes, but it's, I think, of practical interest and importance, that stuff. And then we'll look at this idea of justifying a custom. So where we began on thinking about rule following was with this way that it's so natural to think about your understanding of language. You get the thing in your head, you grasp the meaning that tells you how to go on in your use of the sign. And the basic point here that Wittgenstein, I think, comes at again and again in lots of different ways is that that picture cannot be right. There can't be a thing in your head that pulls everyone together in their use of language. And the simplest way to see it is that if you have a deviant, then the rule in the head is going to be of no help in pulling them back on the tracks. The deviant rule follower might have exactly the same thing in their head as you or me, and yet be going on in the wrong, in what we say is the wrong way. So it can't be right to think that that formula in the head, that grasp of meaning, is telling you how to use a sign in all these particular cases. That drops out. It does no work. Are you comfortable? We're comfortable? I mean, this diagram is my main contribution to Wittgenstein pedagogy, which is partly why I keep showing you it. But I do think that's a central point. Does it seem to you now? I mean, I take it you've read the passages from the investigations quite a few times now. You can see that something like that is the point he's making all the way through. And what I was saying last time was that in the case of logical constants, in the case of terms like and, or, if, then, not, something like Wittgenstein's picture seems capable of proof because you would naturally think for a sign like and, well, the thing I have in my head that tells me how to use the sign in reasoning and inference is a truth table. But as we went over last time, unless you already have some principles of reasoning governing your reasoning, you can't derive principles of reasoning from the truth table at all. So the truth table can't be what's grounding all the uses that you make of the sign in reasoning and inference. You've got to be able to use the sign in reasoning and inference before you can derive anything at all from the truth table. That's okay? Yeah. But then that makes it look as if the way you specify the meaning of a logical sign is by giving the rules of inference. But if we're only going to specify rules of inference in giving the meaning of the sign, what about Tonk? Well, we specify the rules of inference. The rules of inference are perfectly well stated. So if you had something like from A you can infer A Tonk B, and from B you can infer B A Tonk B, and from A Tonk B you can infer A, and from A Tonk B you can infer B. There's nothing, I mean, I haven't contradicted myself or something in giving these rules of inference. But once I've got these rules of inference, I can prove anything I like. Yep. That's very good. That anticipates my main point. Right, no, that's excellent, yeah. So even if you accept the negative point here that you can't derive rules of inference in general from a truth table. Yeah, there is still a question, could I make a truth table for Tonk? Right, that's the question you're raising. And the question you're raising is, isn't that a problem? Yep. I actually agree. I think that's the, I'm glad we agree at last about something, but that's the central point here, right? I mean, have you, I know you guys have been writing the essay and so on, but have you had any thoughts about what's wrong with Tonk? Anyone? Or is Tonk just a new friend and why exclude it? Yeah. You could get it from A to A Tonk, not A. That would be fine, yeah. Yep, very good, yeah, yeah. That's right, you could, all the semantic values. That's right, you could derive anything from anything. It is a contradiction, yes, yes, yes. Oh, there you are. What's wrong with that? You can derive anything you like from anything you like, given Tonk. It sounds great. Yeah. Okay, so there is a kind of basic problem here. You can derive crazy conclusions from it. Yeah. Yeah, I mean, we all see that. Yeah, that's okay. So what's the problem? I mean, is that the problem? Is that the problem already, if you see what I mean? That you can derive crazy conclusions? Or is there something else? Yep.
Well, it seems like the rule itself is
Uh-huh. Right.
But then, given whatever our semantic conditions are, we will typically based on that semantic system,
The rule is sound, yeah. You won't be able to show that the rule is truth preserving. Yeah, I think that's right. Yeah, yeah. So that's bringing truth back in, right? What I said a moment ago was we threw out the truth tables. Yeah, but but you can only talk about soundness where you have truth tables. I mean, for a logical constant like this.
Yeah, so I don't want to say that the syntactic level is fine.
Right.
So we just get with a system that has
Right. I think that's correct. Yeah. Yeah. It's really related to that earlier thing about the truth table. Yeah. We can think of courses of action that conflict with the rules. Yeah. Okay, that's a separate problem, right? The question here is, what is it to be following those syntactic inference rules? Yeah, and I agree that the same point will apply to them as applied to x plus 1. Yeah, that if I say, well, here I'm applying A Tonk B, the rule for A Tonk B, and getting A and getting B, and you say, no, no, that's not how you apply the rule. Yeah, then so far we don't have any way of settling that dispute. Yeah. I just agree with that. It's a further problem to these questions about truth tables, yeah, and the interpretation of the sign, but I think it's correct too, yeah. Yep.
What is the Tonk standing in for? Like, is it selectively switching between and or?
Is it selectively switching? Well, it's a little bit like one and it's a little bit like the other, yeah. But it's a sign in its own right, yeah. I mean, let me give you an example. I don't know if this will resonate with you. This goes back to when I was in high school. I mean, did you guys do complex numbers? Complex numbers were very popular when I was in high school. Everybody wanted to know about complex numbers, and I was really baffled by this. It really stuck in my throat. What are you talking about when you say I? Do people still say I? I for the square root of -1, yeah, and basically. My teacher very kindly took me aside and said, what is going on? Why aren't you getting this? And she said, look, if you ask, the rule is from I squared, if you got I squared, you get -1, And if you've got something that's got the root of -1, you get I, right? And she basically showed me the inference rules and said, use those inference rules, just do it. And I was extremely indignant at this, right? I said, but you just made that up. There's no such thing. What are you talking about? And of course, she was right? Just get the inference rules, right? Don't give me a lot of jazz about whether the thing exists. But it really just stopped me in my tracks. So basically, I'm saying to you with Tonk, right? That's the rules. Yeah, just do that. Yeah. What do you mean there's no such thing? Yeah.
And he's using Tonk to show what point.
Well, that if we throw out, if you got the rules for A and B, yeah, and so suppose I have the rules for A and B here, and here's the truth table, yeah, then a natural picture to have of what's going on with the meaning is that the truth table is the basic thing, and the way you use it depends on that, yeah. But the point I was trying to get at was that can't be the right picture because you can't derive the rules for the use of and from the truth table. Yeah. So that suggests the following picture. Throw away the truth table. Just specify meaning by specifying the rules of inference. That's all you need. Yeah. Just as with I, just specify the meaning by specifying the rules of inference. You got the rules of inference? That's all you want. Right? If you're going to program a computer to talk, that's all you can do. Give it the rules of inference. Right? And if it's got the rules of inference, then what's it missing? And the thing is, it's just following out and the consequence of that train of thought that says, okay, for Tonk, I just specify the rules of inference. What's the problem? Yeah. That's all there is to specifying meaning. Now you know how to go on. Yeah. Yep.
I'm confused because I thought that we said that the problem with the truth table was just captured within it, and but I feel like if you write out the rules of inference in language, you have to interpret those too.
The-
Like,
the-
if
the-
you
the-
put A over A comma B, and I could go, oh, well that means you can derive A from A comma. Well, I mean, or I could interpret the first one upside down. This doesn't matter. But
Yes. No, that's completely correct, and that relates to the question that was being asked from someone right at the back there, that the same point applies here as to the interpretation of this just as syntax. What is it to be complying with this rule in particular cases? I think that's correct. Yeah, you could. The only way I can explain to you what this rule means is to give you examples. Yeah. So that's two separate points. Yeah, there's one kind of point here that has to do with the relation between this and specific applications of the sign. And the other point has to do with the relation between specifying the rules of inference for the sign and specifying something about the truth conditions of sentences using the sign. So both points are correct. Yep. Yep. Yes. Mm. Right.
and all there are instructional elimination rules. Then we should be able to compare instructional elimination rules.
However we like. That's right. Willy-nilly. That's right. Yeah.
Tonk has the same instructional as War, the same elimination rules and.
That's right. Yeah.
Problem. So we can't combine introduction and elimination rules.
Yeah.
For relative connected elimination. But we can't use the truth table either.
Yeah, because we threw the truth tables out. Yeah.
Okay.
Okay. Don't be afraid. That's exactly the point. Right. That's the position we got to. Yep. One last one. Yeah.
So yesterday I was trying
Wh-
and that feels to me maybe kind of like this. Like I feel like if you have the definition of one,
Uh-huh.
you could derive the definition of two.
Yes.
And if you have the definition of two, you can derive the definition of one. If you can't, like derive them both from each other. So maybe
Yeah.
it's okay to go, well, A is equal to A comma P, but then you can't just arbitrarily specify a specific thing like that.
Ah.
Like
Yes.
defining two is twice one and then one is one third.
Yeah. I agree. That's one way of thinking of the intuitive resistance that you feel to these rules. If that's all it takes to get A Tonk B, how come you can get so much out of it? Yeah? If it only took A to get A Tonk B, how come you can get B out of it? Right? Or on the other hand, if you can get both A and B out of A Tonk B, then how come you only need one or the other to get the input? You see what I mean? That's one way of stating the intuitive problem. That's one kind of intuitive line that they're not really in balance in some way. But I think there is a more basic problem than that. Suppose someone says to you, suppose someone you trust, just to filter out where the problems are, suppose it's someone you trust completely, right? Anything this person says to you, you think, well, okay, that's correct. They wouldn't speak incautiously. And they say to you as you come out of the class, you've won $500. Tonk, the sun is shining. Well, should you be pleased? I mean, suppose you knew already that the sun was shining. Right? Well, on the one hand, they only have the right to say this. Well, they do have the right to say this if either they know that you've won $500 or they know that the sun is shining. Right? So that's no reason to feel pleased. Yeah? Because, I mean, it might be that all that's happened is that the sun is shining. And they've in this jaunty way said, you've won $500, Tonk, the sun is shining. But on the other hand, since they've said you've won $500, Tonk, the sun is shining, then you should be able to infer from that you've won $500. Yeah? So there's a really basic problem here, which is it's not exactly deriving a crazy conclusion or not having the rules not being in balance exactly. It's that you don't know what they've said. And what would it take for that whole thing to be true? Do you have to have won $500 or not? And what you naturally want to say is, what are you talking about? You know, what do you mean? You don't know what they've said. So this is the thing about Tonk not having a truth table. That if you ask, what would the truth table for Tonk be? Then, okay, if A and B are both true, then I guess A Tonk B will be true, right? Because if you got A, either A or B, you can infer A Tonk B. So if one or the other of them is true, then you can get A Tonk B, and then you can conclude A and B, and that's fine because they're both true in that case. Yep.
Couldn't you just start from, say, C and D?
Wait a minute, C and D?
Right, that's the point of Tonk. You can literally add in anything you want.
Yes.
From, say, just from C, like I have a shoe.
Yeah.
I can derive, I have a shoe, Tonk, you want $500.
Yep.
You have a shoe, Tonk, you want $500. You want $500, Tonk, the sun shining. Now, it doesn't have anything to start with A and B.
Right.
We can just start purely from C and get to this. So then it doesn't necessarily hold that A and B being true means A Tonk B. Correct? Because, like you said, the cases where A and B are mixed values.
We're just doing the top line of this table.
Right.
Right.
Like, what I'm saying is that doesn't even necessarily hold.
Then if A is true and B is true, then A Tonk B will be true.
Right. Can't you go from C? C is true and say C Tonk A.
Right.
And A could be false for whatever reason.
The case where A is false is down here.
Right.
Yeah. We're just considering the case where A is true.
I understand that.
Yeah. Okay. But
I think you're talking
Yeah. No, you're saying like you can start with A and B Tonk B first and do whatever.
right.
yes.
Yeah. I mean, I think that just the top line, if I understand it, you read it from right to left, right? Since A Tonk B licenses the inference to A,
Yeah.
and because the elimination will can, and it licenses the inference to A, then you sort of go, well, so if I have true on the right, then I have true.
Yeah. And it goes both ways actually. Yeah. The introduction rule, if A and B is both true, then you can get A Tonk B. Yeah. And you got, so it goes backwards and forwards. For the top line's fine. I mean, there are puzzles, but not at the top line. Isn't that all right?
Yeah, sorry, yeah.
Yeah. Over the bottom line, if A and B are both false, then you can't infer A Tonk B, right? Because to get A Tonk B, you've got to have one or the other of A or B. And if they're both, if A Tonk B is false, then you can't infer A and you can't infer B, right? So that's all right. So if they're both false, then, but what about the case where A is true and B is false? Well, you might say, look at the introduction rule. If A is true and B is false, then I can still infer A Tonk B, so it must be true, right? And if A is false and B is true, then I can infer A Tonk B. So that must be true. So that must be the truth table, right? Yeah, but on the other hand, you could equally argue that if A is true and B is false, then if I've got A Tonk B, then I can infer A and I can infer B. So A Tonk B better be coming out false here. Because if I can infer B, well, B is false, right? So from A Tonk B, I can't infer B here because B is false. If A Tonk B could be true and B false, then I wouldn't be able to infer B from A Tonk B, but I can infer B from A Tonk B. So in this case, A Tonk B better be false. Did I do that clearly? Yeah? Okay. So that makes it look like the truth. That can't be the right truth table. This must be the right truth table. But in fact, the right conclusion is you can't draw the truth table. Yeah, there's no truth table for A Tonk B. Yeah? Yep. I could start with not A. I'm thinking about this in a much more minimal way than you, I think. Just suppose you've got, suppose we just have these rows, right? Yeah. And then I've got, what about the case where A Tonk B is false? Yeah. Then I can't infer A and I can't infer B. Yeah. So there's certainly no guarantee that A and B are false. Sorry, that A and B are true in that case. Yeah. Yep.
So it seems like you can start using not A as a premise and A as false. But if you have not A as a premise, then you can use Tonk to get A.
What you want from a truth table is that it should validate the rules of inference in the sense that it truth is preserved from premises to conclusion. Yeah, and you've got the weakest possible introduction rules, yeah, and the strongest possible elimination rules. Yeah, so you get as much as you can out of the thing. So suppose that okay. What is the thing that you want a T here? You and Wilson want a T here in the bottom line. Okay, but if I had a T in the bottom line, then from the case in which A Tonk B is true, that should be, well, wait a minute. Let me take this slowly. Yeah, that's all we're looking at here. Chaining the applications of the rules together, which is what you're doing, is going to lead to really any conclusion you like. I mean, I could actually just bypass the reasoning you gave and said what I have as my B. What I just said is right. and you're wrong, right? And then do your chaining to get that. Yeah, just cut out all this complicated reasoning. But let me just walk this through. Suppose that if A is true and B, if A is false and B is false, then that guarantees that A tonk B. Yeah. Then my introduction rule should not be demanding the truth of both A and B, because my introduction rules have to be as weak as possible. Yeah. So I shouldn't be demanding the truth of one or the other of A and B in order to get A tonk B. Yeah. So I should be able to derive A tonk B even in the case in which I don't have A, in the case in which I don't have B. Right. But that's not the inference rule. Yeah. The inference rule demands that one or the other of A or B be true. So I'm not chaining the inference rules here. I'm not considering what happens when I chain the rules. Just look directly at the basic rule and see what happens to it. Yeah. So the reason I'm putting the F there is if we didn't have the F there, then you wouldn't need both the truth, either the truth of A or the truth of B, as in your introduction rule. Yeah, it wouldn't be the weakest possible introduction rule. Okay. Okay. This needs more discussion, but is that reasonably clear so far? Somewhat rattled, but okay. Okay. Now, I think something like this is actually the basic problem with Tonk. And one way to see it is to consider, the thing about Tonk is kind of, how should I put it? It's like a kind of swaggering crazy that you can get any conclusion at all out of. So anybody's reaction on first encountering Tonk is, you just did something weird. But consider star. Star is like Tonk's peculiar younger brother. Yeah, that is kind of quiet, but very, very strange. And here's star. The elimination rule for star is the same as the elimination rule for OR, right? But wait a minute, what's going on here? Oh, I see, yes, right. Okay. Right. I don't know what happened there. Okay, so the introduction rule for star is the same as the introduction rule for AND, right? And the elimination rule for star is the same as the elimination rule for OR, right? So in order to establish A star B, you've got to establish A, you've got to establish B. Yeah? But from A star B, you can't infer A and you can't infer B. All you can do is say, argue as follows: if A, then C, and if B, then C. Therefore, from A star B, C. Yeah? So it's like the elimination rule for OR. Now, are you going to be able to get strange conclusions from that? It's like it's like a mirror image of Tonk. Yep. But you're not going to be able to get strange conclusions from star, right? Because you're not going to be able to get anything much out of it. Yeah. But it's also weird. It's just as weird as Tonk. Even although it's harder to put your, as with these quiet, weird ones, it's hard to put your finger on exactly what is going wrong. But again, suppose someone says to you, you've won $500, star, the sun is shining. You still don't know what to make of it. What is going on? And someone only has the right to say that if they've established both that you've won $500 and that the sun is shining. But you can't derive from it either that you've won $500 or that the sun is shining. So what have they said to you if they say that? You don't know what they're telling you. Yeah? So there's something wrong here with star 2, even though you can't derive anything crazy in the way of conclusions from it. And again, the trouble is you can't make a truth table for it by the same argument as before. You don't know, well, basically you don't know what to write for the case where A and B have different truth values. That, I mean, that's just is this problem. You don't know if the sun is shining, but you haven't won $500. Is this whole thing true or not? There's just no saying, because if the whole thing has to be true, then it would be all right to say you've won 500, to conclude you've won $500, but you don't have the right to draw that conclusion. On the other hand, if it's false in the case where you've won $500, then if it's false in the case where you've won $500 but the sun isn't shining, then you should have the right to conclude from the statement that the sun is shining and that you won $500. So you don't know what to write in the truth table. Yeah. So what that makes it look like is you do need truth tables at some level. You do need to talk about truth and reference at some level. But even if it's not as a kind of driver to the language that keeps us all together in our use of the signs. Okay, these are very laboratory examples of language that is really looking very strange. But there are real-world cases of this where something like this is going on, and it really matters. I mean, for each of you, I promise you, if you think of cases of offensive language, there are words. I mean, I don't wish to turn the room into a semantic cesspool. So it's not it's not that I want us to have lots of real examples being produced of words that we all find offensive. But I promise you, for each of you, there are words where if someone else in the class started tossing them around, if you just heard the word, your blood would boil and you would think something ought to be done about this. Right? I take it that's true for each of us. Yeah? So in the next couple of minutes, I don't want you to use any of those terms, but just keep them in mind, right? I mean, the interesting thing about this kind of language is that if someone says to you, that was a really stupid remark, or you're very, very ugly, or something like that, then you may get mad at them, but it's not that the language was okay. Yeah? I mean, it's not that you used a bad word. The words are fine, right? Some people are ugly and stupid, but it's just not you, right? You can say things, you can say very objectionable things, and the language itself be perfectly okay. But the idea with offensive language is that the words themselves, somehow the word itself is something you object to. And a basic question is, how can that be? I mean, I remember talking to someone just after the election of the ANC in South Africa. I was talking to someone who was working on a government committee that it had just spent 3 months going through all the place names in South Africa and winkling out all the objectionable elements in all the place names. You see what I mean? And that makes perfect sense, right? There are words that you just don't want to have them in the language. You don't want to have them being used. But how can that be? So let's suppose you take an example of some offense. I mean, these are kind of very twee examples, basically, because I don't aesthetically, I don't want to get into the cesspit. But suppose someone's using latte drinker as a term of insult, right? This is a typical latte drinking comment, you might say, right? So suppose your introduction rule for X is a latte drinker is this person drinks lattes, right? That's all right. That's a perfectly coherent introduction rule. And then your elimination rule is from X is a latte drinker, you can conclude that X is an elitist intellectual out of touch with ordinary people. Yeah? You can specify the rules of inference there. That's okay, right? I've told you how to use the term. This is like I or Tonk, right? Now you know how to use latte drinker. Yeah? What's wrong with that? But you see, what happens here, this is like Tonk in a more diluted, diluted way, as it were. That with Tonk, the thing is, once you put it into the language, then you can derive lots of conclusions that you couldn't before. You can derive anything you like. Once you've just got this word in the language, now you can derive lots of conclusions that you couldn't derive before. You see what I mean? You see the power of it. Just get that into someone's vocabulary, and now they can establish lots of things they wouldn't have been able to establish before. Yeah? Nobody realized before that you were an elitist intellectual or in touch with ordinary people, but you just drank that cup, and we got you. You know, now we know what's going on with your sort. Yeah? And you might say there's no balance between these two. If that's the input, then how can you get that output? And there's a more basic problem, which is that you don't know what it takes for it to be true. Or suppose, I mean, I hope to God there is no such thing as a yad. I mean, I just made this up, right? So if there are any yads here, I am sorry. Right? But suppose you use yad as a term from, I mean, this is a bit more like real life examples. Suppose you get X is from a particular geographical area, yeah? And then you can conclude X is a yad. And then from X is a yad, you can conclude, the elimination rule is X is violent and unpredictable, or X is criminal, or whatever, yeah? Or X is unpunctual, whatever terrible thing you think of, right? Now you can prove lots of things about this person just because you've got this term in the language. Yeah? So I want to suggest the reason that we think some language is offensive is basically it's like Tonk. Tonk is like a laboratory example. You know, it wouldn't really fire anybody up or anything, but just because it's a laboratory example, it's very, very clear what is going wrong there. Yeah? But that's why language in itself can be offensive. It's not just that someone's saying something to you like stupid or ugly or something that you disagree with. It's that they've got that word in their language, and that once you have that word in your language, you're just, if you don't examine your language, you're going to be able to derive all kinds of conclusions that you couldn't have derived without having that vocabulary. And if you're just born speaking a language, I mean, we don't actually, just at the age of 5, critically examine the vocabulary that we have. Yeah? So if you're just drilled in it from when you're first learning language, that you have all these terms in your vocabulary, then lots of inferences that you make are going to be suspect. They're going to be wrong. And you have no way of correcting them, because that's the inference rules that you learned. So putting in terms of truth conditions, if you ask, what does a term like yad refer to? You actually get the same problem that you had with Tonk. You have no way of saying which group this is talking about, yads. Just as with Tonk, you can't draw up a truth table. With yads, you don't know whether all it takes for it to be true that someone is a yad is that they're from this geographical area, or does it also require that they're unpunctual? You see what I mean? Just as you don't know what way to go in drawing up the truth table given the rules of inference, so here you don't know what way to go in finding what the reference of yad is from these rules for its use. I mean, I've focused on cases where the language is offensive and you want to eliminate it and it has bad upshot. But I mean, in principle, there could be cases where the use of the language is actually benevolent. I mean, I was trying to think of I was trying to think of examples, but you know, an example might be one of God's children, right? All it means, the introduction rule for one of God's children would be something like, this is a human being. Right, if this is a human being, you can infer this is one of God's children. And from the elimination rule would be something like, and from this is one of God's children, if the elimination rule is, it follows, this person ought to be treated with respect and kindliness. You see what I mean? So you might think, well, it's actually sometimes quite good to have this kind of stuff in your head, in your vocabulary. Yeah, there might be cases of benevolent language as well as offensive language. But really, you don't want any of that stuff. Ideally, you want to be able to just think clearly about what's going on and make up your own mind, rather than being driven about by the language. So what I'm suggesting is the key point about these terms is not exactly that they have undesirable consequences. It's that you don't even know what they mean. They haven't been given a secure meaning. And of course, the reason that in practice everybody gets so fired up about them is that the kind of strongly negative consequences. But the more basic problem is that they haven't been given any truth conditional meaning. You haven't been given a specification of what we're talking about when we talk about this category or that category. Okay. Yep. That I think is a different phenomenon. That's just different. Yeah. It's an interesting phenomenon, but it's a different one. One, two. Yeah.
So like is the idea that because of flexibility or because of the actual state how we can use there some
I'm saying that, yeah, what's wrong with Tonk is that you can't draw up a truth table for it, and that therefore there's a place for truth tables in a characterization of our understanding of language. And I'm saying this, there are cases where this really matters, that what's wrong with these offensive terms like yad is you can root to the problem in saying, but what does it even mean? What are you talking about? Do you mean someone who comes from this geographical area, or do you mean someone who is unpunctual or whatever it is? And the whole reason the word has such power is actually that there's a kind of instability there. There's no way of saying what it's talking about. Yeah. I hope that makes sense for whatever word you've got in your mind is the one that really fires you up. Yeah.
I'm just wondering why we're analyzing derivation.
Uh-huh.
Like the reason of the expert
Uh-huh.
could that just be a disguise? Like, yeah, all the others are functional,
Right. If you had just a separate belief, right, and it wasn't part of the meaning, that you could do this inference, yeah, then what you say would be perfectly correct. But in that case, I don't see that the word itself would be objectionable. The word itself would be perfectly fine. It would just be that this belief you have about yads would be mistaken. Yeah, that's just a mistaken belief. But when people object to a word, the feeling is not, let's hang on to the word, but just remove people's objections. You see what I mean? The sense is that the word is so deeply embedded in this way of reasoning. Yeah, I mean that example I gave last time of which. Yeah, I mean that we can discuss right now because it's we're a little bit cooler about the phenomenon of witch hunting and so on. Yeah, but at the time, if you're trying to get, if you're in Salem or whatever, you're trying to get this way of thinking out, then it would not be a convincing way to put it to say there are witches, all right, but people have just very unfortunate beliefs about them. You see what I mean? The notion of a witch is just embedded in that way of reasoning. Yeah.
I was thinking, like, you could even have a concept that was maybe well defined and
Yeah.
and then suppose like nobody actually thinks
Yeah.
but you can still say X is delicious something, even though they're
Yeah, and you wouldn't have the right to the conclusion because you didn't have the right to the premise.
Yeah.
Yeah, you're describing it seems to me just an innocuous case, and that's fine. I don't want to disagree, but what I do think is that the reason I hope this seems credible. I hope this seems recognizable. That the reason people object to particular words and say I want this out of the language, I don't want to see this in print. Yeah, is because they think it's embedded in that kind of reasoning. You can't separate it from the use of this kind of reasoning. Yeah. Whereas you're describing a case where you really could separate it from the use of those patterns of reasoning. Yeah. And you're saying don't just do the separation. That doesn't explain why the individual words makes people's blood boil. Yeah. Okay. Okay. So. This is the basic thing that Wittgenstein is right about, it seems to me. You can't derive the rules of inference from the truth table. But if this discussion is correct, then there is still a role for the truth table. Namely, you can just drill people in using rules of inference and reasoning in particular ways. That is what we do. We just drill them in using the words in particular ways. But then there's a bit where you say, but what am I doing with this use of language? What's going on? What am I about? What am I up to? And that's where the truth table comes in. It explains to you what you're doing when you reason like this. So the truth table is coming in not as what keeps us together, not as the wheel that drives our whole practice of reasoning in this way, but as something that makes our practice intelligible to ourselves, so that we can say, this is what we're doing, we can explain what we're doing. We need the truth table to make our practice intelligible to ourselves. And without the truth table, if you just got Tonk or star, you say, well, with star, I just can't make sense of what this means because I can't do a truth table for it. So I think this is shaping up to a criticism of Wittgenstein for saying there is only the use. It's not that we just use words and we just say this is the way of my people and leave it at that. I reason like this. It's very clear with offensive language that we think our practice of using words the way we do is something that can be criticized, or you can try and justify it. And with a sign like and or tonk, then you would do it by giving a truth table. But with any other term, what you're trying to do is say what you're talking about, what you're referring to, what this word does for the truth conditions. So I think we could keep Wittgenstein's point that use is more basic than knowledge of truth conditions. We could say Wittgenstein got it right about how we go on, about we just do go on in the same way, and that's basic, that's what everything else depends on. That's all right. But say that we could still ask for justification or criticism of what we're doing in acting as we do. We can say, but we need to be able to rationalize what we're doing. We need to be able to explain what we are up to in using words the way we do. And that's our role for truth conditions in making use intelligible. So we could hang on to the idea we started this class with, that there's something important about truth, even in the face of Wittgenstein's critique, and say Wittgenstein puts, Wittgenstein is right in saying that graph of truth conditions isn't a basic thing that drives everything else, but it's still required for us to understand what we're doing, to have some kind of oversight as to what we're about in using words. Okay, Davidson and Friday. Thanks for making it to class today. I realize it must have been a struggle. Okay, thanks, Rich.